Hello and welcome to Book of the Mouse Club, episode 44, Wednesday, July 29th, 2020.
Morning, monsieur.
Where are you off to?
The bookshop. I just finished the most wonderful story about a beanstalk and an ogre and...
That's nice. Marie! The baguettes! Hurry up!
I'm sorry, but how can one possibly pay attention to a book with no pictures in it?
My dear child, there are a great many good books in this world without pictures.
I almost bounced clear out of the book. Some bouncing, huh?
Come home or make myself known.
J. Thaddeus Turtle, Esquire. Have you never met him? You will find his story in this delightful little book, The Wind and the Willows.
I've come to return the book I borrowed.
Finished already?
Oh, I couldn't put it down. Have you got anything new?
Welcome back. I'm your host, Courtney, and I am joined, as always, by the Mermaid Mini to my Typhoon Tessie, Emily.
Hey, Courtney, we are really enjoying the nautical theme this summer. First, we searched for buried treasure with pirates aboard the Hispaniola, and now we're going to go diving in the Nautilus with Captain Nemo.
Yes, and joining us in the journey today is a man often referenced on this podcast, but almost as mysterious as Captain Nemo himself. It's my boyfriend, Dr. Douglas Kern. Doug is currently a professor of English at Valencia College. He's joining us today with his knowledge of media and the foundation of a PhD in theater, film, and television from the University of York. Welcome, Doug.
Well, hello. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Thanks for joining. Listeners may recognize your name from my various asides and stories over the past 2 years of our podcast, but I'm so glad they get a chance to actually hear from you today. Would you mind just sharing a little bit about yourself and your love of Disney?
Sure. So my love of Disney actually relates back to my love of film. It's not an unusual narrative, I think, for most of us, but my love of Disney actually started when I was a child, and my mother would buy all of the VHS tapes. She actually owned the very first Pinocchio release, and I would remember she would put those on for me. And then in about 1989, it's a debate between my family and I whether we went in 88 or 89. I actually went to Disneyland, and though I didn't know it then, I was going to become, in my later life, a huge fan of Francis Ford Coppola, and just by coincidence, or maybe my love of Michael Jackson, I fell in love with the attraction Captain EO, and so that became a big part of my life. And then, very luckily, met you. And because of your love of Disney, I was shown the parks in a way that I'd never seen them before. I'd actually never been to Walt Disney World. And then I got a brand new love for Disney and really fell in love with the parks because of the way they combine the magic of storytelling.
Well, we're glad to have you here today to have some storytelling. We had talked about having you on to discuss this body of work for probably over a year now, but it really came together as part of our summer cinema series, focusing on live action and literary classics. This is our second in a series of 3 themed episodes. We kicked off first last month with Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, and today we're diving into another iconic Disney film and science fiction classic, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Emily, could you share a little bit about the history of this whale of a tale?
Sure. So here's a little about Jules Verne and 20,000 Leagues. So Jules Gabriel Verne is a French author born 1828 and died at the age of 77 in 1905. And he's considered the creator of the novel genre roman scientifique, known today as science fiction. I see a theme with many of our 19th century authors. Jules Verne originally studied law to please his family, but in the course of his studies, he fell in love with science and language and fell into literary circles in Paris, which inspired him to write his love of science into novels. After his first book, 5 Weeks in a Balloon, Verne was offered a publishing contract, which then produced over 50 novels in his lifetime. Other notable titles include Around the World in 80 Days and Journey into Center of the Earth. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is Verne's 6th complete novel. It was met with huge success and published in over 140 languages. The novel, like many literary works of the 19th century, was serialized between 1869 and 1870 in the French magazine magazine of education and recreation. In 1871, 20,000 Leagues was published as a complete story, and it's believed that Verne was inspired by early submarine models on display at the 1867 Exposition Universelle, so the World's Fair. So going into this book, has anyone read it before? Anyone have any prior knowledge of the story of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea before we read this?
So I hadn't read it. This was my first time reading it, but I was excited that we put this on our list to do. Like, I feel like maybe in the back of my mind, I was like, oh, I'd like to read that one day. And that really ties to the Disney film. I feel like my introduction to that came from those sing-along song VHS tapes, and there's Kirk Douglas singing Whale of the Tale on the undersea one. I was always kind of like, oh, like, what's that from? And then my family got the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea DVD in the early 2000s, and we got our first DVD player, and that's really where my love of it started. So longer term goal, I guess, of like, I'll get around to it. And now we put it on the podcast list, and we're finally doing it. What about you, Doug?
I'm actually rather embarrassed because I had never read any Jules Verne, and I had never seen the Disney movie. I just completely had no knowledge at all. I had seen clips, I think, of Kirk Douglas in the Disney film. That was about it, and I had no connection at all of who he was playing or what that was about. And then I met you, and you would talk about your love of the film, and I think slowly I started to get interested in it because of your interest in it. And then you showed me the film, but I don't remember when I watched that.
I think it was about maybe 2 or 3 years ago, but definitely before we started the podcast. I feel like we went to visit my dad, and he has that DVD, which I have to say, one of those, they don't make them like they used to. Lots of good bonus features, which will pop up, spoiler alert, on my my references list. But we borrowed it for the weekend. Like, I feel like we went to go see him, and I was like, oh man, Doug's never seen this. Can we borrow this? Can we take it home with us? And then we just popped it in and watched it one weekend, and you liked it.
It's really something special. It's one of those DVD discs that, unless they completely replicate it in another format, it's now out of print. And so it's one of those things that they're not going to do it that way again. It's a work of art because the menu, the special feature menu, is just fantastic. It's a little bit of work, but it's fantastic. So I agree with you. What about you, Emily?
So Doug, don't feel embarrassed. I also have never read a Jules Verne prior to this. I remember Jules Verne coming up in high school English classes, but I think we might have read a short story or something that he wrote, but never a novel. So this is my first real Jules Verne work because I can't even remember what that short story was. And I have never watched the film until I prepared for this podcast. So I came in completely blind. And like you, Doug, anything I knew about 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was because of Courtney.
I'm just being exposed as a big nerd here, I guess.
It's one of those that I feel like as a Disney fan, particularly a Parks fan, knowing about 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a submarine voyage used to be in the parks. We'll talk about that later. So like I just always knew about like what the Nautilus was, what it looked like, the poster art, but I didn't know the story. I didn't know anything beyond that. So it's really thanks to Courtney and your lovely Nautilus glass that you have from Trader Sam's that I know what 20,000 Leagues was prior to reading the book and watching the film for the first time.
Thank you for saying that, Emily, because I think if I had come to Walt Disney World as a younger person, I would know Verne and I would know 20, because I think that's how a lot of young Americans were introduced to Verne. So I think because I had never been to Walt Disney World, I think that's one of the reasons I never got it, because I wasn't exposed to the wonderful way that Disney had adapted his work.
Well, neither of you should feel bad about having not read any Verne, because despite my apparent and very clear love of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the film, I hadn't read any other Verne either up until last week when I finished this book. So we've been checking off quite a lot of classics off of our list with this series. With our previous read, Treasure Island, that was considered the epitome of an adventure story. And Jules Verne is sometimes considered the father of science fiction. What about 20,000 Leagues do you think classifies the novel as science fiction? Is this book different from other science fiction books you've read?
Well, I'm kind of a nerd myself too, so when you all invited me to do this, I got really excited and I started diving in and reading about Verne and the book. And I actually find it interesting that some critics challenge the idea of Verne as a father of science fiction. I mean, maybe he's more accurately defined as an author of scientific fiction rather than science fiction as a genre, because sci-fi is often more speculative. I think what Verne does most often is extrapolate the contemporary science of his day to write his adventures. So he's influenced by William Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, for example, as much as he is Edgar Allan Poe. And when comparing Verne's work to, say, Mary Shelley, the mother of science fiction, who published Frankenstein in 1818 before Verne was even born, I think you can clearly see the differences. Like, Shelley speculates about the possibilities of science, while Verne applies existing trends to add credibility to his adventures. That's why we get those exhaustive catalogs and lists in Verne's work, which bore the heck out of me. So while he's not always 100% accurate, Verne wants the reader to understand his fiction as scientifically feasible and believable.
Doug, I have to agree. When I looked through my bookshelf, I was trying to think of what other science fiction books I've read, and I really haven't read much science fiction, but I think as a movie genre, a lot of us have seen science fiction, and we think of a lot of films. Like last week, I just watched Alien. Like, that's science fiction. And like you said, Frankenstein, I think, is a great example. And like you said, how it's extrapolating science, that it's something that maybe is impossible but fantastic. But like you said, Verne is more realistic. And even when we read the sections about the giant squid attacking the ship and finding Atlantis, it's exaggerated, but it's not completely far-fetched. It is possible. So I like what you said there, that maybe not the father of science, but definitely scientific fiction. He was very factual, and you are not the only person who got a little bit bored reading about the many, many, many species of fish that went by his window.
It's well documented that he was very adamant about the ways that he made everything that he wrote realistic. So when the cannonball is fired from Earth to the Moon, he would talk at length about how that could really happen. You could really fire a cannonball in that way using that technology. And so it was only later in the adaptations of Verne that people would make it more fantastic with unexplainable rocket ships.
I'm curious if people in 1870 were fascinated by how exact he was in his descriptions. And like you said, just the nature of where we are in context, we're like, oh, we know that. But if they were more intrigued by those passages that explained all of the different sea creatures and stuff and the amount of research that he has done to put into this novel, I wonder if they were more fascinated by it than maybe we were as contemporary readers.
Well, in his time, he was being, he wasn't as critically acclaimed as we might think, although his books sold really, really well. It was the critics more or less credited him to inventing a new genre of writing, but they, as I said, they equated it to a scientific fiction. In other words, he used the science of the day, and he pushed the limits on that science of the day, but he used the science of the day to spin his adventures or stories. And so in that way, they were saying he was inventing something new. But, I agree with both of you. I certainly agree with Courtney. And look, when I say that he's not always called the father of science fiction, that is the minority. That is not the majority.
It's an interesting critique, though.
Yeah, it is, I think.
Particularly, like you said, with Frankenstein, like that, I putting that in a timeline chronological perspective, that how many other works, it's kind of like Treasure Island. There were so many other Robinson Crusoe is an adventure novel, but Robert Louis Stevenson is considered the author of the adventure novel. So it's interesting how that can progress and change.
And
Go ahead.
Absolutely. There is a through line there. I mean, it's really cool that you did that book first, because, as I say, Verne was as inspired and influenced by those authors as he was Edgar Allan Poe, who was doing really interesting things at the birth of science fiction. So I'm interested in, you have done some episodes on fairy tales, which I love. And this book, like some of the fairy tales you've discussed, was originally published in a different language, French, obviously. So do you think that the English language translation bring challenges to the reading experience?
I'm not entirely sure. I didn't trip up on anything. I think most of what was a challenge for me, I was reading the Barnes & Noble Classics version. I bring them up all the time. They're one of my favorite editions to read for classics. I like all the footnotes they have. And most of the footnotes and endnotes where I was getting stumbled was a lot of the references they made, which I don't think was necessarily a language barrier. But the way we would reference pop culture today, they were referencing their pop culture and mythology, and there was a lot of French references in there, I guess, reflecting back. So language-wise, I don't think it was necessarily a barrier in translation, but some of their cultural references, I had to go read the endnotes and the footnotes to kind of get where the professor was talking and referencing in his, I guess he wrote this as kind of like a journal.
So this is where things might get a little interesting, because usually Emily and I are very good about making sure that we're reading the same edition for those cases. So we often, as Emily said, read the Barnes & Noble Classic edition for our fairy tales, but I think all three of us read different editions of the book, though I'm sure we'll still have the same takeaways in terms of those themes, those morals, those characters. But this kind of stemmed from Doug and I reading different editions, and now I know that you read a different one. But I think that'll be fun. I feel like, usually, as I said, you and I planned this, but it'll be cool to kind of see if anything differs greatly. For Doug and I, it was mostly just small word choices. So Emily, you said you read Barnes & Noble. Doug picked up a really pretty leather-bound copy maybe about a year ago when we were visiting Disney's Vero Beach Resort. You kind of was like, I'm just going to start reading this by the sea, because we had kind of thrown out that we would do this episode at some point, but you really got into it within the past month to prepare for this. But I was reading on my Kindle, and I just grabbed the Bantam Classics edition from the library. So as Doug and I were both reading this simultaneously, just enjoying some time outside reading, we'd kind of touch base on where we were in the book. And some certain lines would be phrased a little different. At one point, they uncover a shipwreck at the bottom of the sea, and in my edition, it's referred to as the Revenge, and in Doug's, it's the Avenger, which similar.
Mine was the Avenger.
Okay, so you and Doug probably read the same thing, and mine was just a little different. But it's like it's almost the same word, but it's not. I remember something else that came up was the Professor Annonax is the narrator, and he refers to his assistant, which I'm gonna go ahead and say Conseil. I've also heard it referred to as conceal in different audio, might interplay between the two. But whatever he made reference to Conseil was very like almost a dry humor in my book, like kind of a snarky aside. But the way that it was worded in Doug's book didn't necessarily have the same tone. So I think it's interesting that we read some different pieces.
Courtney, your version, at least from what you shared with me, was a little bit more colloquial in terms of American English, whereas mine seemed to pull from, the wonderful, strange catalogs and lists that Verne was working with. I mean, it kept using words that I wasn't as familiar with, whereas your chapters or even words within your chapters would be more familiar to me when you read them back to me. So it was just interesting to see the difference there. And I think that one of the big issues that I have with my particular translation, and I read from the World Cloud Classics, translated by F.P. Walter. I bought it for the cover, and I know it looks leather bound, but I bought it this way because it's actually like a rubberized cover, and we were going to read these in the pool. So I knew that if I had this one, it wouldn't get as damaged in the water, because it's like I can't describe it. It's like a rubber cover. It looks leather, but it's not.
You judged the book by the cover.
I did. So my big problem with my translation is that, big spoiler alert here, if you have not read up on Captain Nemo or know anything about him or want to know anything about him, you might want to pause this and go watch whatever you're going to watch or read whatever you're going to watch before you come back. But spoiler alert, in my book, it totally does away with the mystery. It tells who he is and where he's from, which is supposed to be a big thing in 20,000. You're not supposed to know who he is or where he's from. And so I was very curious, do your versions do that, Emily or Courtney?
About Captain Nemo? No. Nothing about where he's from.
Mine kind of alluded to it, because I think we talked about this, because you had told me as I was reading, you're like, oh, like Captain Nemo's actually, spoiler alert, in the sequel revealed to be from India, so of Indian origin, and we kind of talked about James Mason and the film, and maybe we'll get to that. And I feel like when they're in the Indian Ocean in the Pearl chapter, it kind of alluded to when he rescues the Indian man that's almost drowning in the sea. It says something along the lines of like, of his same origin. So maybe not as direct.
I don't remember the line about the same origin, but I do remember the other characters being surprised that compared to any other human they've come across outside of the Nautilus, he's been very dismissive, whereas to this person he was not, and he even gave him riches to help him go about his way. I don't know. So that is interesting. But yeah, I didn't note anything though, unlike the film, which we'll talk about, which gave more about his family, just a little bit more. None of that I had in my version.
So mine flat out just ruins the whole mystery. He rescues an Indian man, as Courtney described, and then at the end of that chapter in my version, he has a discussion with the professor and actually says, I am one of him. And so he just completely ruins it. Interestingly enough, when I was doing the reading on Verne and all that, Verne had a very lucrative, although crazy relationship with his publisher. So first of all, he didn't get paid near what he should have gotten paid for his work. He did, at his start, he was doing 3 novels a year for his publisher. And he stuck with his publisher up until his publisher's death. And then he started working for who took over for the publisher, his publisher's son. He finally, after working himself almost to death, he got it down to 2 novels a year. And what's really interesting is the best-selling books for Verne were his illustrated copies, where they would do these really wonderful engraved illustrations and put them into the books. Well, the publisher worked it out that Verne would make nothing on those illustrated copies. So the best-selling versions of his stories, he made not a cent on, which I think is just highway robbery. But yeah, it's crazy that he would. So he wants to hide this mystery, because originally Verne wanted to make Nemo Polish, and he wanted the avenging nature of Nemo. He wanted to be against Russians, and his publisher said absolutely not. We have Russian readers, and we're not doing that. So it was the publisher who demanded that he hide Nemo's any connection to Nemo at all, so that no reader would be offended. And it's weird that my version just throws that out. So it's just strange.
I just looked back through my version and found that line. So the ending line of that chapter, reads, "That Indian, sir, is an inhabitant of an oppressed country, and I am still and shall be to my last breath one of them." But I didn't read it that way. I read it that he is from an oppressed country. I didn't quite make the connection that he's from India itself. So I guess my version does have that in there. I just did not read it in that context.
I wanted to note in the terms of some of the difficulties of translation too, when we were talking about Treasure Island, I had shared that I did that as an audiobook. So I had the physical book in my hand, but just wanted to listen along and get the pirate voices, but I was still like reading with my eyes across the screen. I was like, oh, well, I'll do that for this one because 19th century literature. But I went to a free podcast audiobook version, and I lasted like less than a minute because I was like, the text doesn't align. Whereas whatever I found for Treasure Island, I guess because it was written in English, I was reading word for word along with the audiobook, and I was like, nope, I can't do this. The words are too different. So I read the old-fashioned way for this, but that was a challenge as well in terms of translation.
So one final note on the issue of translation is that again, in studying this, I did learn that his stories have been completely butchered by translators, all of them. So we have to be very careful. There was a push in the later 1900s to correct some of these errors, but the damage had already been done. And so they change characters' names, they cut complete sections, they change plot lines, they reveal things that Verne and his publisher never wanted revealed. So I think, Emily, unfortunately, we don't have what Verne wanted us to read, or at least we don't have what his publisher wanted us to read. We have somebody's adaptation taking what Verne later did in the so-called sequel, which is called the Mysterious Island, and then adding that into our section. So I'm really curious to see even if the man he saves or the character he saves at that moment is even Indian in the original French, because I would bet that he's not.
That would be interesting. And I feel like that's just kind of what we run into with a lot of 19th, 18th century literature, because that was before copyright. So everything's public domain and everyone can keep changing and moving things, even though he had a publisher at the time. There was no way to really track that. So as it moved into English, they might not have even had control over what the English translation looked like. And then it just keeps moving and moving from there. That was a really interesting discussion. Especially in America, because Verne started as a playwright. When he was in Paris trying to study law, he wrote his father constantly and said, Daddy, I want to be a writer. And his dad would write back and say, you better keep studying law, son. And because his father was a lawyer. So, but he started writing plays, and that's where he got all wrapped up in the literary circle. But he couldn't get his plays off the ground. He didn't get an actual success until he was 35 years old. So it took him quite a while. But he started as a playwright, and when he actually did succeed as a novelist, he started co-writing adaptations of his novels as plays, and two of them were very, very successful. And when they brought them to America, of course, because it was, across the seas, they completely butchered them. They did whatever they wanted to. So there would be the official version, and then there would be like 8 other versions that had nothing to do with Verne's narratives. I guess we'll just have to hunt down an 1870 copy to actually know, and have someone that can read French with us to actually know what it says. But let's move forward in our discussion here and talk about themes and morals of the story. Did you guys see any overarching ideas that persisted throughout the book?
I feel like that's something that will come through regardless of translation, like the heart of the story. And to me, a lot of them come from Captain Nemo himself. He is this mysterious man who's kind of resigned himself of humanity. And I see kind of this theme of like avenging or revenging, depending on your translation, oppression in a way. And I don't know if that's having known this idea that he is Indian and thinking back in terms of 19th century and like colonizers, colonization, the British Isles, which makes it even more interesting that James Mason is cast as him. But again, we'll get to that. I just thinking about Captain Nemo's reactions to different things. He shows this humanity to this, individual man who's struggling and drowning. So like you see that Nemo has a heart in that way, but then you also see a very cold side where he is going after these warships. Or correct me if I'm wrong, Doug, was there a relation to like slave ships, or was that not as overt? I can't remember when we were discussing if that was something you came across in your research.
Yeah. So Verne, like most writers of his time, has his own problematic issues within some of the stories he tells, with some of the letters that he writes, but he was absolutely always against slavery of any kind, and he wrote that into many, many, many of his stories.
Yeah, you hear throughout this book, even our three, I guess, prisoners of the Nautilus, Conseil, the professor, and Ned, that they even not reference themselves as slaves, but like the rights of prisoners in a way. Did they have the right to leave the Nautilus when they wanted to, what their liberties were? So those words and phrases definitely came through a lot. And with that background, Doug, that makes a little bit more sense that he would write that a lot into his work. I reflected a little bit on the science as well, that the professor and Nemo always have this back and forth about, the professor really wants all the science to get out there and to share this with the world, but Nemo's more reserved about it. So I was picking up a little bit of some ideas about the beauty, but also the dangers of science in the wrong hands. Science needs to be nurtured, also, I guess, should be free, but it could be used for oppression, maybe linking those ideas together if in the hands of the wrong people.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I think that's the book. It's all about oppression, and I think that Verne was thinking about colonialism, and he wasn't actually thinking about the British colonialism over India. He was thinking about Poland and Russia, but it became something else as he worked with his publisher. That's another story. But yeah, he's dealing with this. Like I said, it's a technology of its time, but he's taking it, to these extremes and telling wonderful adventures about the technology. But then because it's mixed with that story of someone who is absolutely against oppression in any form, it becomes not a novel about optimistic science, but a novel of what would happen if this science falls into the wrong hands. And I think that Disney was able to tap into that in their film, which I think we'll talk about in a bit.
Yeah, I think that does really come through clearly in the Disney film. But let's get a little more into the story and some of those characters. We've shared their names, kind of toss them out here and there. I'd love to know from everyone what your favorite, least favorite part of the story was, along with characters. Doug, why don't you go first?
So I think I kind of spoiled this because the way I talk about it, I think my passion might come through for what I find most interesting about this story. For me, I find my favorite character is actually, I'm cheating a little bit because I'm going to say my favorite character is actually two characters. It's Nemo and the Nautilus. That's my favorite character. I say them together because I think that they're one thing. I think that Nemo is not Nemo without the Nautilus. And I think that the Nautilus is not the Nautilus without Nemo. In fact, as I was, doing this research, I came across a 2002 animated version published by Dick, which was a famous, they would do a lot of cartoons and animated films, mostly for television. In that version, Nemo wears a big N on his jacket, and that's not uncommon in the films that were made prior. But in this one, it's interesting because he tells the professor that the N stands for both his name and his ship's name. And he says that line distinctly. So I think that's a film representation of how these two entities are one. And I love that. I guess what I'm trying to say is, to me it read like Nemo is a man, but with the Nautilus he can become the Hulk. So it's like what's Bruce Banner without the Hulk? That's how I read it, and it excited me. To that end, I think my favorite parts are when Nemo is able to use the Nautilus as he would, or as Bruce would use the Hulk. So like when there's a chapter when Ned wants to harpoon whales, and Nemo tells him no, that we don't need to kill the whales. And he makes a really prophetic declaration where he says, if men keep killing all these whales, there will be no more whales. So in that way, Verne is very, he predicts the future. But what happens is there's creatures that are attacking the whales, and Nemo becomes very angry, and he's like, now those creatures need to die. And so he uses the Nautilus to start killing these creatures that are attacking the whales. And I got very excited at that part in the novel, because again, it's all wrapped up as a metaphor for Nemo's ideology. He believes that anything that attacks the innocent anything that oppresses the innocent needs to die. And that's fascinating to me.
I think my explanation is not going to be as awesome sounding as what Doug just said. But I agree that Nemo is my favorite character. I think even when we move into the film, he's my favorite, mostly because I like his wisdom. I like his mystery as a character. And then I think translating into film, we get there's more Nemo in the film than there is in the book, which was interesting. We'll talk about that. But I agree. I really liked his character because he seemed to understand something also about the sea that even the professor, someone you would expect, he's called the naturalist. He knows a lot about the sea and its creatures, but Nemo has the wisdom of the sea and its creatures. And I really loved the scene where they go to their underwater cemetery, and the way they honor their group of men, their crew that works the Nautilus, and how connected they are to the sea. I thought that was a really beautiful chapter when they talked about that. And he says that line, I'm paraphrasing, the professor says, your men are safe from the sharks in this grotto. And he says, yes, from sharks and from men. And I thought that was very prolific in a way, thinking about how we honor people and respect nature, the sea. So I thought that was very interesting. But overall, my favorite part of the book was probably the last third. The first third and the last third I thought were really exciting. There was a lot of explaining what the Nautilus is and their adventures. The middle got a little long. But I really enjoyed the last third of the book, pretty much from the South Pole exploration forward. So the giant squid, they're going to the volcano, the warships. I just thought the action was a lot better in that last third. It was more connected.
So I am going to tip my hand here towards the film. Absolutely love Captain Nemo and the film. But Doug asked me in the pool, what's your favorite character? And for some reason, my gut reaction was Professor Annonax. And I've noodled on that a little. And I think that's because, as we've established, I really love the film. I know you're watching the film through the camera's lens, but when you're reading the book, Professor Annonax is your narrator. And I'm going to connect this to another book I love, which is The Great Gatsby. And in The Great Gatsby, Gatsby is this mythical figure, and you're seeing it through Nick Carraway's eyes. So Nick is the actual narrator of the book, and you're viewing Gatsby through his eyes. And I feel like the reason my gut reaction was that Professor Annonax was my favorite character as I read it was because I am seeing Captain Nemo through the professor's eyes. He's marveling at him and this man of the deep, and they're shared knowledge and love of the ocean. The professor does have narration in the Disney film, but it's not carrying you all the way through. And I would even argue that the professor takes a bit of a back seat in the film to some of the other stars. So I guess I just appreciated like, oh, this is different from the film that I love. It's kind of cool to hear him tell us the story as I'm reading through it. In that regard, my favorite part of the story was when they stumble upon the Nautilus. They're kind of wrecked, lost at sea, and they swim over to the Nautilus to just stay afloat, realize that it's a ship, and they're banging on the door like, let us in, let us in. And I thought this was such a little comical scene. Two men from the ship come up, spoiler alert, one of them eventually is revealed to be Captain Nemo, but they speak their own language. It's not clearly identified. Professor Annonax isn't sure, but the professor recognizes that they need to be let onto the ship. So the professor goes ahead and tries to talk to him in French. That doesn't work. Then I think Conseil is from Belgium, so he tries to tell him the story in German. Ned Land, being from Canada, is able to speak English and French, and he tells the story in English. So they've told the same story, like, hey, this is why we're here. We got lost at sea. Let us in. And eventually Captain Nemo lets them in, and then it's later revealed, and I just thought this was kind of funny. Captain Nemo was like, oh, I speak all those languages. I just wanted to make sure that you were who you said you were, and it checked out. Oh, and I think the professor says it in Latin, too. He's like, yeah, you got all those, and the story was consistent, so I let you on the Nautilus. So I just thought that was a fun little exchange. I liked that, and I would say, Emily, you said you liked the last third. I kind of like the first third, in that it's the mystery of what is this Nautilus, the scene that I just described, and then the professor viewing the Nautilus for the first time and like taking all of this in as someone who loves the ocean and studies the sea. And I think we all have the same least favorite part. As much as I love the professor, I will say his lengthy descriptions of a lot of things, like how pearls are made and all of the different 3.5 paragraphs of fish at the bottom of the sea. My eyes glazed over at that point.
Yeah, same. And Courtney, your description of that comical moment reminded me of one in my favorite part of the book, when they're talking about the squid. They're talking about, like, could a giant squid actually exist? And Ned and the professor are going back and forth. And then Conseil jumps in, he's like, does it look like this? Like, with these kinds of tentacles? And the professor's like, yeah. And he's like, it has a beak for a mouth? And the professor's like, exactly. And he's like, it's right there out the window. And I'm kind of sad they didn't do that in the film.
Oh, Peter Lorre would have been so good at it.
So good.
Does it have a big beak and 8 tentacles? That's my really bad Peter Lorre impression.
But there was some good comedy in this book. I think it was hard to find, but it is there. And your favorite part there just reminded me of that scene, and reminded there is a little bit of comedy here if you know how to look for it.
I love that scene. I thought that was so funny. I actually laughed out loud when I read it. And what I gather is one of the reasons he was able to do that in his books, and he did it often, is because of his start as a playwright. And so he really honed that skill to write witty and fun, because he didn't write dramatic pieces. He wrote funny musicals at his start in Paris. And so that was his thing. And so that's where he got sort of his love of comedy and comedic dialogue. So I did find it really funny at times.
I think that contributes a lot to what we all said was like parts of our favorite parts. A lot of it focused on the dialogue. When the characters were talking, I mean, usually that's how it goes in literature. You're more engaged when people are talking, but the dialogue was definitely a strength of his between his characters versus descriptions of the scenes, even though those were fantastic and scientific as well. But I think the strength comes from his characters.
Absolutely. I mean, there were some chapters which to me were unnecessary. It was just a full chapter of jargon. And I just thought, wow, this is a bit boring. But so even with the boring bits, why do you think this story, or how do you think this story is relevant and popular today?
For me, I think it is the characters, those interactions, someone mysterious. You've got the three friends. There's an escape plot. I think a lot of those themes, we kind of saw this in Treasure Island, where even today you still imagine like, oh, what if I was stranded on a ship or a desert island? What would I do? And so I think a lot of those adventures are still popular. They're still fantasized about, even in contemporary times. But I think the characters, hearing from Nemo and those discussions and differences between him and the professor, and particularly Ned, how they all kind of clash with personalities and with their wants in the world, I think is something that a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. I do think a lot of modern adaptations understand that it's problematic in the sense that there are absolutely no women here. And I think that one of the things Verne was trying to do was be realistic in terms of who was allowed aboard a ship and whatever. But regardless of that, it is severely lacking in any type of gender politics. I mean, it's just all men. And so they'll often they'll make the professor a woman, or they'll give Nemo or the professor a daughter, who unfortunately ends up usually falling in love with Ned. But so they try to do it. The Disney film, which we'll talk about, it does it in really interesting ways, where the only love interest they give Ned is a seal. But we'll talk about that. But I think the way I read it is that this story still resonates because it's a story about avenging oppression. And I think that that's a story that we can really get behind, especially today. And that's how I read it. I think that that's how Verne wanted it to be read. But again, we're reading it with a contemporary lens, and we weren't there at the time. But remember, Verne was there during a very volatile time in France with revolutions and unstable politics. And so he understood, the problems of oppression.
I think a lot of its relevancy, though, does tie to the Disney film. I'm a little biased. Interestingly, not the first film adaptation, dating back to a silent film in 1916, which used underwater photography even back then. It's been adapted countless times, but I feel like most people would agree the Disney one is the definitive version. So if you're all right, I might just take us over into the history of that.
I can't wait.
Well, and I have to give Doug some kudos for braving through lots of bonus features with me over the weekend and collaborating to pull this little summary together for you. So it's easy to trace a connection between Verne's early optimism regarding scientific progress and the artistic innovations of the Walt Disney Studios. It's no surprise then that Walt and his staff chose 20,000 Leagues as a source adaptation in one of their earliest full-length live-action films. Released in 1954, the film was Disney's first to be shot in CinemaScope and reportedly cost more than any other film up to that point in time. And the costly quality shines through. The studio spared no expense, hiring an experienced crew of decorated artists to contribute to their version of the story. Curiously, Walt chose Richard Fleischer to direct the picture. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because Richard was the son of Max Fleischer, who, along with his brother Dave, became one of Walt's biggest rivals during the 1930s with animated cartoons such as Betty Boop and Popeye the Sailor. I loved hearing the story in one of those bonus features that Richard felt like he needed to ask for his father's blessing, recognizing that Walt is his biggest competitor. And then Max allegedly called Walt and told Walt that he had great taste in directors. So he did give his blessing for his son to direct this feature. Though Fleischer and his screenwriter, Earl Felton, claim Verne's episodic narrative lacks a cohesive story, the film's plot more or less follows the novel, with a few Disney flourishes, of course. Most notably, the casting of Kirk Douglas as Ned. The film's audience is encouraged to side with this rebellious harpooner rather than the cerebral professor, played by Paul Lucas. In addition, Ned is given a catchy tune to sing, a whale of a tale, and befriends, or steals, depending on the way you look at it, a new addition to Verne's story, Nemo's pet seal, Esmeralda. Conseil, played by Peter Lorre, also begins to favor Ned as the film rolls along. You simply can't finish a summary of this film without mentioning Nemo and his Nautilus. James Mason's portrayal as Nemo often supersedes Verne's influence, with his performance serving as the model for many subsequent adaptations. The same can be said for Disney legend Harper Goff's design of Nemo's submarine boat, the Nautilus. The film won 2 Academy Awards, one for Best Special Effects and one for Best Art/Set Decoration. It's difficult to read Verne's story without picturing Goff's Victorian steampunk design of the monster-like ship, which became the model for several attractions across Disney theme parks, and the film still lives on beyond home viewing possibilities today. When the film was released in 1954, it was the perfect tie-in for Walt Disney's television program, which premiered in October of 1954, just a few months before the film's December release. The very first episode featured clips of the film, and additional behind-the-scenes making-of features were included in the episodes Operation Undersea, which won an Emmy for Best Television Documentary, and Monsters of the Deep, where Peter Lorre and Kirk Douglas introduced the climactic squid sequence. The film is considered to have set off a cycle of Verne-inspired films from other studios, like Around the World in 80 Days and Journey to the Center of the Earth. Later, Disney continued to adapt Verne's work, and the film In Search of the Castaways, which came out in 1962, is inspired by The Children of Dr. Grant, also by Verne, and they distributed an updated version of Around the World in 80 Days in 2004. His work has also inspired Imagineers in their visions of Discoveryland at Disneyland Paris, Tokyo Disney Sea's Mysterious Island, and some attractions tied directly to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, but we'll get to those theme parks later. Let's venture back through liquid space and compare the film to its text source. What did everybody think of the film?
I was blown away. Particularly, Courtney and I had the opportunity to watch this film just this past weekend, in a pool at our friend's house. Shout out to Holly and David, on a huge screen. And I was just completely engrossed from start to finish. In fact, I never got out of the water. Maybe once to use the bathroom, but other than that, I never got. I just. There were times when I would float. We had these little floaties that we could sort of sit on or float in, and there were times when I would just float to the front of the pool and just grip the edge of the pool and watch the screen as if I was in the front row in a cinema, and I was engrossed from start to finish. And when it was over, I turned to Courtney and I said, "That was amazing." I don't know if it's because I saw it on a big screen. I don't know if it's because I was in the water. I don't know what it was, but this film, it holds up.
I agree. This is my first time watching the film ever. I don't think I've even seen Whale of a Tale in a Disney sing-along. So this was completely new to me, and it won an Academy Award for Best Special Effects for a reason. And like you said, even for a film in 1954, it's extremely well made, and those effects still look good. There are movies that are made in the 90s that don't look as good as this movie does with its old school movie magic. A lot of the pluses, I think, made the film more attractive to me than the novel. We're going to talk about some of the differences. I actually liked the ending of the novel a little better. But we'll get there. But overall, I really enjoyed it. It was fun. I think the sprinkling of a little bit of music in there added some lightheartedness that the film needed to kind of keep it going. And I just really enjoyed it.
I'm sure no one is surprised, but I love this movie, and I have for a long time. I think just being a Disney Parks fan, like the attraction intrigued me in my youth, which we'll get to. That sing-along clip that I saw, I was like, what is this? So when my dad brought home that DVD, which is the DVD that Doug and I watched all those bonus features on this past weekend, I just was absolutely captivated by it. it's just the special effects, as you said. It's a good story. It has a little bit of music. When I talk about music, though, I have to give it up to the score of that film because, I get chills just like as the overture almost starts as you're watching the film. And that has often, even though the attraction isn't still in Walt Disney World, you can hear the score at the entrance of Magic Kingdom Park. It's part of that main entrance loop. So it's just, I don't know, I have an emotional tie to it. So I'm like super biased.
And it's a shame. I watched it on Disney Plus, but like you said, the bonus features aren't on Disney Plus. Disney Plus, get on that.
They need to.
And I'm curious, like Doug was saying, I think you mentioned earlier, just the look of the film on the DVD is also really good. I wonder if the Disney Plus looks any different. You guys would have to tell me. But I'm intrigued.
Shout out to Disney Plus. The version we watched in the pool was the Disney Plus version.
Okay.
When I was talking about the extraordinary or extravagant look, I was actually talking about the menus for the special features.
They're just really elaborate.
They're very elaborate. It's almost like you're hunting for buried treasure, and you have to sort of go behind door number 1 to unlock this particular menu, which would have 3 special features. It's very elaborate in a way that they just wouldn't do that anymore in a DVD or a Blu-ray format.
The concept of the DVD, which might I add is a 2-disc special edition because
that's amazing.
The special features are on their own disc. It is the Disney Vault. So they basically did like a CGI vault, and you like enter the vault and these reels come down every time you start a new treasure. Emily, as like your love affair for the archives, I feel like you absolutely would love this concept. Maybe we can find it on YouTube. They apparently did a few early release DVDs. I mean, this was like right when DVDs hit the market, and so like the appeal of DVDs was all of these special features. So our friend over on Twitter, Ellen, said that she had, I believe, either The Parent Trap or The Love Bug or one of those also older live action films that had the vault. Actually, I think Pollyanna has a DVD like this because, side note, Doug and I stayed Club Bubble at Disney's Polynesian 2 years ago, and they let you borrow DVDs for free and watch them in your room. So I was like, I've never seen Pollyanna, but all they had was disc 2, which was the special features. Like they gave me the Pollyanna disc, and I remember I was like, this is like this 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea disc with the elaborate vault, and I was like, this is cool, but I've never seen Pollyanna, so like maybe I need the actual disc.
Courtney, you are the special features queen. Most of my DVDs are at my parents', and since we have Disney Plus, I've left my parents with the DVDs because even though I've hooked them up with streaming, I got my mom to finally watch Imagineering Story like a month ago. She finally figured out how to use the streaming. So they're still very DVD oriented. So I don't have like any of the fun special features. So I love hearing you talk about them.
I will say that it's rather sad when they do transfer something over to a high def or something like that, and they lose those special features, because I have some old DVDs that the Blu-ray or the high def editions do not have the content in it. Criterion Collection is still doing that kind of stuff, but otherwise you often lose some of the magic that they were bringing to these home releases when DVDs first came along.
So moving further into the film, we'll come back to the special features. How do you guys think this film, does it hold the integrity of the story, of the original story? So how do you think the film compares to the book?
It's a hard question for me to answer because it's almost like, did the story uphold the integrity of the film? Because I'm just so immersed in the film. But I would say yes. We'll discuss those differences at length, but a lot of those themes in terms of the idea of oppression and science and man and what can he do with it, while there's liberties taken with the plot, I think it absolutely holds through and also carries the same mood that's in the book. It's when you're adapting from paper to screen, you use music and you use lighting and stuff to enhance that, but I feel like the mood carries through, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I can hear that, and I tend to agree. I'm stuck on this concept of fighting oppression, though, and that's what I think. That's what sort of I was able to fall in love with as I continue to dive deeper and deeper into my investigation of this story, its writing, its author, and its adaptations. I think that as much as I enjoy the film, I sort of wish that Ned Land, played by Kirk Douglas, didn't somehow become the hero, because I think Ned is sort of anti-revolution. He wants to just escape this thing, not realizing that he has come upon Nemo and what Nemo is trying to do. And Nemo has let him into his world in a way that, you know, the oppressed let colonizers into their world. So Disney I mean, you know, it was 1954. You're speaking mostly to an American audience. You're going to, spoiler alert, you're going to have to kill that character who says revolution is the answer. And at that time, that was going to be the thing. But I kind of wish that Disney hadn't. But that, you know, that's me. That's where I take it. So I think for me, Disney loses a bit of that revolutionary fervor.
I guess I fall somewhere in the middle because I had not thought of it that way. And now that you said that, Doug, I definitely see what you're talking about. I think also for what Disney was trying to do in the audience, it was more about what they could make awesome on film. It was about the special effects. It was about the entertainment value more so than that theme, which I think is still there. But like you said, the ending we're going to get to is drastically different, which I guess changes the meaning of that theme. But I also agree with Courtney that I felt like the mood was similar. It had enough similar elements that you could definitely recognize this as Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, even though they took some liberties with the adventures and particularly with the main characters. I thought overall, though, it was very recognizable as 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dig in. What are the major differences? And you know, giving credit to the film, because I loved it. I love the film. Are there any pluses that made the story better?
Okay, so I think I went total teacher mode on this. When I watched the film, I have my notebook next to me right now. I have a Venn diagram, old school comparison tool.
I love it.
And there's definitely, yeah, Courtney, I know you'd appreciate that. There's definitely more differences than similarities. My center circle has very little in it. But overall, there's enough there. But I think the biggest difference, and I know you guys will bring up others, is who's considered the main protagonist. In the book, like Courtney, you mentioned, we see the entire story through the professor's eyes. So he's the protagonist moving us forward. But really, and you even see this on the poster artwork for the film, Ned is the protagonist in this story. And his relationship with Conseil is very different than what it is in the novel. Conseil himself is very different than he is in the novel. And I think that was the biggest difference. Is in the book, you focus a lot on the relationship between Nemo and the professor. And this was a bigger shift to Nemo and Ned and them being drastically different characters. I found that as the largest difference. A big plus for me, I think like most of, or similar to Treasure Island, is just the pacing. The fact that they didn't focus as much on the science. It was there, but it wasn't detailed. Therefore, it moved along a lot faster. We went adventure to adventure. And the adventures were a little bit more strung together. One purposely led into the other, whereas I feel like the book is a lot of vignettes and the adventures could all stand alone. These were a lot more connected.
I feel like this is going to be a smaller difference, but one thing that I thought was interesting, and I have to give credit to one of Doug's texts that I was flipping through, they pointed out that in the book, the Nautilus is powered by electricity, and that makes sense. It's a newer technology in the 19th century. And while the film still takes place in the 19th century setting, doesn't update the time period at all, it's more alluded to that this is like an atomic power that's powering the submarine. And I felt like that was interesting, just given the context of the film being released in 1954. Like, it kind of brings it into the Cold War era in a way. In terms of pluses, though, I absolutely have to talk about the squid battle, because I feel like that is the climax of this film, one of the most iconic scenes, like this all-out giant fight against the squid. And I felt a little disappointed by the squid battle in the book. Like, it was still there, but in my mind, like, we're just cruising in the Nautilus till we get to the squid battle. And then it was like maybe 8 pages in my Kindle edition. I was like, oh, the squid battle's over. So to me, that's a major plus.
There are differences, but I get confused when I hear Fleischer in the special features say that there was no narrative in Verne's novel, because to me, there's a lot of jargon and there's a lot of catalogs and lists of undersea life and other things, of course. But all of the through lines are there, and Disney is able to pick up on them. Again, as we've already discussed, what they changed is that Ned now becomes the hero. And I'm not convinced that, while I am convinced that the professor is the protagonist of the novel because we are following his journey, I'm not convinced that he's the hero of the novel. In fact, I don't even know if we're supposed to agree with him by the end. In the film, I think we're sort of slapped in the face that we have to agree with Ned, that Ned has won and Ned was right all along. And so that's a major difference that I see. In terms of plussing, I guess for me, it takes what Verne does so well in the novel, or at least in the English translation that I read, these comedic encounters between Ned and Conseil. And it pluses them because somehow it got 2 actors who liked each other, and you cannot deny the chemistry between Peter Lorre and Kirk Douglas. They just click, and every time they're together on that screen, it's just a blast. It's a blast to watch them. I remember the scene where Ned punches Conseil in the face because he says, you deserve that one. And then he says, oh, well, I deserve it too, so you can hit me. And Conseil punches him in the gut. And then from the special features, we learned that every time that Kirk Douglas rubs or ruffles Peter Lorre's hair, that was improvised, and it's just something that they did. And Kirk Douglas himself says that he just loved Peter Lorre and he was his buddy on the set. So even though I see it in the novel and I laugh out loud when I read those comedic scenes, I think that the film was able to plus it because they found 2 actors who liked each other.
Absolutely. I totally agree with the comedy. I think it brings the story more to life. Something, though, that was a big difference for me was also the order of the adventures, which normally I think at first it didn't bother me. Some of the adventures were even combined, like when they go walking on the ocean floor in the scuba diving suits. That was also combined with the shark and the buried treasure, like all in one, whereas they were very separate in the film. I don't think necessarily it matters, but one I think did matter, that to move the plot along, but also that through line that we kind of lose in the middle of the book about the dynamics between these characters, is that we see Nemo attack a ship a lot sooner in the film than we do in the book, because a lot of that character uprising where the professor finally kind of reconciles that he needs to leave the Nautilus and Nemo because of their moral differences or something, that comes in that last third of the book, which is what I said I really liked. It starts moving that plot a lot more, but I think what the book or what the film did to plus it was they moved that up. so that we are constantly in this struggle between the characters throughout the entire film. Whereas in the book, Ned is completely different. He's compliant. He always wants to leave, but he's always offering his services to help Nemo, or he's kind of, okay, yeah, we'll wait. It's fine. He's a little bit not as animated, but with the moving of that scene up, I think we get a lot more of that friction is what drives the rest of the film.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. I think that one of the things that we get in the beginning of the novel is that there have been some skirmishes with the Nautilus and other ships because those ships are not warships. And Nemo is only attacking warships. He's only attacking ships that are attacking other people. Because, again, that's what he's totally against war, oppression. That's what he's fighting. He's not fighting he's not going to bother anyone else. That's what he's fighting. And so I think that some of the ships that he ends up bumping into by accident in the novel, at least unless I read it wrong, are not warships. And that's why they're not sunk. But I agree that bringing that to the forefront makes it a little bit more exciting and we can follow that quicker. I do want to say, though, that unless I'm reading, or I think Emily and I are actually reading a similar translation, because when you read that last line of one of the chapters, it really resonated, and I think it's the exact same line in my chapter. And I think I bought my version at Barnes & Noble as well, even though it's not the Barnes & Noble classic. But I think there's a difference between, in the novel, there is a shark attack. Nemo is attacked by a shark, and Ned saves him. And there's a very poignant moment where Ned says to Nemo, you deserved this revenge. In other words, because you saved my life by letting me on the Nautilus, I needed to save your life. And then in the squid battle, Nemo ends up saving Ned's life. And then the exchange happens again, and Nemo says to Ned, I owed you this revenge. And so it's kind of like, I paid you forward. In the movie, we don't get a shark attack in that way. We don't get a saving in that way. And Ned actually is the complete savior in the movie. So I found that to be different as well.
And speaking of lives, probably the biggest difference is the end. Nemo's very much like, I will go down with this ship. But in the book, we get a sequel.
Yeah, which is weird, very strange. So the sequel is about 5 sort of people 5 Americans who were involved in the Civil War, who were sympathetic to the North, who escape prison by the South in a balloon and end up castaways on a deserted island. And on that island, spoiler alert, we find out that that Nemo is there, stuck because his Nautilus got stuck, and he ends up mysteriously helping them without telling them who he is until the end of the book. The weird thing about this is that no Verne scholar can agree that this is actually some sort of sequel to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, because 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea takes place, we are told, in 1856, but The Mysterious Island, its so-called sequel, takes place in 1865, and in The Mysterious Island, the so-called sequel, Nemo is much, much, much older. He's an old, dying man. In fact, spoiler alert, he dies in The Mysterious Island of natural causes because of old age. So it doesn't make sense chronologically that Nemo could be this young or young-ish captain in 20,000 Leagues and then an old, dying man a year earlier in The Mysterious Island. So I don't know I think here's what I think Jules Verne and his publisher were trying to do. I think they were trying to sell the serialized novel. I think that's what they were trying to do.
Also, with the ending, this is where I kind of liked the book a little bit more. I guess Disney's ending it's more final. It's more, I guess there's more closure. But I think a credit to the science fiction genre is that you're not supposed to know. There's a mystery. Did he survive? Is the Nautilus still afloat? And like kind of makes you think it still is, and like the myth lives on. And I kind of like that. I didn't like the rushed conclusion of after the warship battle, he lost consciousness, and then, oh look, I woke up in a hut and I'm being tended to by a nurse. That felt a little rushed, but I did like the not knowing what happened to Nemo and the Nautilus, just because I think it fits that character of Nemo so well. So I kind of liked that. I was rather disappointed that he dies in the Disney film and goes down with his ship, which I guess is poetic for a captain, but I kind of liked the mystery of the book a little bit better.
I think another thing that the film does well, but is in contrast to the book, is that it sets Ned Land and Nemo up as foils to each other. Like, they are very much opposites and in contention throughout the film. So that kind of brings me to another question. Does anyone's favorite characters in the film differ from the novel based on those differences in depictions, or what those actors are able to bring to the performance?
Well, yeah, I think you said it best, Courtney. I mean, that the way the film is able to depict those differences between Ned and Nemo are just really visually, and, you know, the dialogue, the script, everything, it just really comes together in a way that I don't think the novel, or at least my adaptation of the novel, is able to capture. I remember when they first sit down to eat, Ned is trying to dig in and he seems to be enjoying himself until he suddenly realizes that he's eating, you know, creatures of the sea, and he's disgusted. Even though he enjoys the flavor, he's disgusted by what he's eating. And there's a bit of that in my version of the novel, but it's not, because I can't see it and I can't visualize it in the way that Disney was able to do. Especially Kirk Douglas is absolutely charming. Everything he does in this movie, it's just, I can't imagine someone not being won over by his performance. The way he laughs, the way he performs, it's just stunning to me. There are other differences, but Emily, what do you think?
Well, Esmeralda is my absolute favorite character in this movie. She stole the show for me. I have to agree. I think Ned, if I had to hang out with a person, I still want to hang out with Nemo. I guess am more attracted to his morals and his wisdom still. I think he was portrayed so well in the film. But you're right, the performance of Kirk Douglas's Ned is just so good that as much as I was frustrated with Ned as a character, for instance, signaling, other big difference, the bottles and the messages he brought about the warships that surrounded them at the volcano. So as much as I was frustrated with him as a character and disliked a lot of his actions, you also are completely engaged while you're watching him. So in a way, I guess that makes him a favorite character, even though I don't like his character, if that makes sense.
I just absolutely love James Mason as Captain Nemo in this film. Like, he
so good.
Does such a good job, and I now feel a little bad that it's like, oh, this was whitewashing, but he does a phenomenal job, like, just bringing the aura of, like, sophistication to that character and keeping him mysterious. And, you know, it's a much more subdued role in contrast to, like, Kirk Douglas's very physical performance. So I like the juxtaposition of both of them. Like, they do emerge as my favorite characters in the film versus what I was able to glean from the book earlier.
I will say Peter Lorre, as soon as I saw him on screen, I was like, Ugarte! Casablanca! I was so happy. Casablanca, one of my all-time favorite films. So I was like, I've never seen him in another movie before, so now I can add to my repertoire. And I thought he was great. He was funny. He had that humor, that slyness that similar to his character in Casablanca. little bit of a spy, but more comical.
This is a very different role for him because up until this point, he had been more of that character in Casablanca, very similar character in The Maltese Falcon, also with Humphrey Bogart. Like, he is more known for, like, almost these, like, creepy type of things. I believe he's in Frankenstein, right? Like, yes, master. I'm just working my Peter Lorre impressions into this episode. This was a turning point, I think, in his career. So give it up for Peter Lorre in the comedic role.
Well, that's actually a mention in the special feature. They show, well, it's in one of the early Disneyland episodes, but it's also featured in one of the special features on the discs. That Walt Disney himself quotes Peter Lorre and says, Peter Lorre, quote, said, normally I would be more, typecast as the squid than the character I am in this film. And what he meant was that he would normally be cast as the heavy. Peter Lorre was usually the creepy. He's not in Casablanca, but he's normally the creepy, scary guy. I mean, he got his start in M, which if you haven't seen, you need to watch that movie because it's fantastic. But and he plays a serial killer in that film. So it's he's usually the dark. But unfortunately, and it's not Disney's fault, it's just Peter Lorre's fault for being so freaking good in 20,000 Leagues. Afterwards, he gets typecast as the fat comedian. So, oh well.
But he's good in all of it. So, really fun characterizations there. But there's one thing I want to make sure we do talk about in this episode, because as iconic as the film is, that led to an even more iconic, I think, presence across the Disney theme parks. So, Emily, do you want to kick us off with a little bit of theme park history?
Sure. So we're going to start with the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea exhibit at Disneyland. This opened shortly after Disneyland on August 3rd, 1955, to fill space in the mostly vacant Tomorrowland. This was a walkthrough attraction featuring set pieces from the film. It was supposed to be a short-term and temporary thing, but proved so popular that it lasted over 10 years before it closed in August of 1966.
And I have a little fun fact for you. Captain Nemo's organ, which was in the walkthrough, is now in the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland. So timeline checks out there in terms of that attraction closing and then the Haunted Mansion opening at Disneyland. I will say there's another Disneyland attraction that even we were questioning. Doug and I were like, wait, were the submarines at Disneyland 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea or not? And we dug in and we did our research. So those submarines opened in 1959, now replaced by the Finding Nemo undersea adventure, but they were not officially tied to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. There is a submarine in the fleet. Walt Disney liked to brag that he had the 8th largest submarine fleet in the world that was named the Nautilus, but that was actually named after a real submarine, which was powered by atomic power in the late 1950s, almost harkening back to then the Nautilus of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So picture, like, I don't want to say World War II because this is post-World War II, but like mid-century submarines were the style of these attraction vehicles. So while there was a Nautilus, quote, ride vehicle, not in the style that you're thinking of. So what's most commonly, truly, the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea submarine voyage is that of Walt Disney World, which opened with the park in 1971 and lasted until 1994. So that submarine attraction at Disneyland was popular, but instead of replicating the submarine at Disneyland's Tomorrowland, the Walt Disney World Imagineers opted to put a similar attraction in Fantasyland. Submarines were not the futuristic vehicles like they were for guests in the 1950s. They kind of lost the novelty. So they felt like they could make a Fantasyland setting for the ride make sense by utilizing that 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea IP. So the boats are more designed to look like that famous Nautilus, using the Harper Goff steampunk type style, and the attraction is then narrated by Captain Nemo. So you've stepped aboard his submarine to continue through the journeys of the deep. Interestingly, some scenes in the attraction include elements of the book that were not included in the film. There were just a lot of episodes in the film, like where they visit the lost continent of Atlantis, or they visit the polar ice caps. Those are story beats that are included in the attraction. So it's not an attraction in the sense of like, oh, you ride Snow White's Scary Adventures and you're seeing the film play out before your eyes, like Peter Pan's Flight or something like that. It's more like, hey, you're in the world of the story, but we're not reliving the movie itself. This attraction, though, is a sore spot for many longtime Walt Disney World fans. When it closed in 1994, it was just for an alleged refurbishment, like, hey, just going down seasonally, but it never came back. What's even weirder is that it sat dormant for basically 10 years, and this is where my obsession begins. So as a child, I visited Walt Disney World as an infant, so my parents tell me that I rode the ride, but, like, I don't remember the ride. But what I do remember is in, like, the late 90s, early 2000s, visiting Ariel at her grotto, which would have been, like, kind of behind the carousel, a bit adjacent to Pinocchio's village house. And that queue was situated next to the attraction's lagoon. So they put a statue of King Triton there to kind of tie it as a picturesque background of, oh, look, pretty water. But that water was so clear, you could still see the track for the attraction. And so that just fascinated me as a child and led me down the rabbit hole of 20kride.com because I was that much of a nerd, and I still am, and I got to revisit that for this episode. But that's all about the history of the ride and, like, the cult following, and I think I'm part of the cult now. But the lagoon was eventually filled in 2005. So for 10 years, the attraction just sat there. Like, even the animatronics were just rotting underwater. It's wild. It was replaced with Pooh's Playful Spot Playground across from the Winnie the Pooh attraction. So I love these little Disney details where, you know, there's often an Easter egg. So as a nod to that lagoon that they filled in, you can find a carving of the Nautilus etched into the wood on the, like, inside Pooh's home right above the doorway. It's pretty tiny, but you can look up a picture online. But by 2012, that playground was then relocated to the queue of Winnie the Pooh to make room for new Fantasyland. So kind of like where Mine Train and Little Mermaid are, was where the original attraction set. So the Little Mermaid attraction also features a nod to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. If you're early on in the outdoor standby queue, there's a little water fountain and, like, water feature to your left. If you look into the rockwork, you can spot the Nautilus also etched into the rock formation there. So even though the attraction is now long gone, it still lives on. And even someplace not too far over at Seven Seas Lagoon. Do you want to take that one, Doug?
Sure. Before I start, I just want to say that Emily and Courtney, your knowledge astounds me. I don't know how you do this, but it really is very impressive. So one of my faves is I feel like I'm taking a step down here, is the Nautilus drink at Trader Sam's Grog Grotto at the Polynesian Resort in Walt Disney World. I've had the privilege of having it more than once, and it'll set you back a pretty penny at about $60 a pop. But I think the souvenir mug is well worth it. It's modeled after Hoppergroff's iconic, Nautilus theme, and it's a pretty mug. I'm actually looking at it right now. It's a gorgeous mug. Of course, you could go for the drink alone and not take home the mug, but to my mind, that defeats the purpose. Don't get me wrong, it's a tasty, spicy combination of rums, liqueurs, and juices, but at Trader Sam's, it's all about the theming. So it's meant for two, so you'll need a partner with you anyway, which means you can share the tasty drink for about $30 a piece and still take home the memory. Of course, then you'll have to fight about who's keeping the mug. As with most of the specialty drinks at Grog Grotto, the servers will engage in some themed shenanigans as your drink is delivered. For this one, you'll want to look around for some special effects, portrait lighting, and duck any incoming water sprayed by the cast members. Okay, so maybe they won't be spraying customers anymore once they reopen. But if you're
true.
But yeah, whoops. But if you're a fan of the Submarine Voyage and 20,000 Leagues attractions, you'll want to listen up for some familiar dialogue. And I don't want to spoil it for any of you, but it's fantastic. Emily, you want to talk a little bit about some of the other Disney Parks attractions?
I will. I do want to say, though, I am one of those people that's had the drink without buying the mug, and I regret it. So buy the mug. It's worth it. The drink is delicious. I think it's one of the best ones on the menu. I love that it comes with flowers. Am I right? Doesn't it have flowers floating on top?
I believe it does, yeah.
It's beautiful. I think I might have tried someone else's. I was the +2, the second or the +1 on the drink, so it wasn't mine. So I got to sample the drink, but I don't have the mug, and it is on the top of my list the next time I can get back to Trader Sam's to get that. But now let's go across the ocean to Tokyo Disney Sea. So their attraction opened with the park in 2001. This version is unique in that the ride vehicles aren't actually submerged underwater. So think of it like a Peter Pan's flight type vehicle mechanism floating from the ceiling. You're on what more looks like an enclosed diving bell. So you're sitting with only, I think, about 6 people per car versus the original submarine voyage attractions at Disneyland and Disney World held 20 to 30 people, I think. So this is much smaller, meant just for your party. So the water effect is used in the 2-paned porthole with bubbles to create the illusion that you're underwater versus actually going underwater. A little different, but definitely I think more sustainable as an attraction, that they can maintain it better and keep the cost lower.
I want to go on that so bad. It's Courtney and I's dream to go to Tokyo Disney Sea. It's just a dream. I really want to go. But we did get to go to Paris.
Jealous.
Yeah, which was fantastic. And at Paris, instead of Tomorrowland, they have Tomorrowland. They have Discoveryland, which is really themed to Jules Verne and his sort of, this is the future, but based in science. And so there you can go in the Mysteries of the Nautilus, and it's in French when you go, but I don't speak French. I apologize. And it's a walkthrough attraction in Disneyland Paris. And I believe it's an update of the original Disneyland walkthrough that Emily mentioned. I only wish that I had a stronger grasp of the narrative before experiencing this attraction, because as I mentioned before, I knew very little about Jules Verne's book or his story when I went to Paris. But even with the little bit of background information that I had, I found it pretty special. So I hope attractions like these can continue to survive the push for more technical advancement, because I remember entering the Nautilus in Paris, and I know it's going to sound silly, but I really felt transported to a different time and place. The magic of a walkthrough is that you can experience that transportation at your own pace. So, I mean, Courtney was, as always, when we're at Disney, my guide, but I explored all of the wonders of the ship as she told me about the film and the story. And the pictures didn't come out the way that we wanted to because of the sparse lighting. We took some pictures, but they didn't come out very well. But if memory serves, the intricate details truly match the film's interior design. I mean, Nemo's organ is there with a special appearance by the captain himself. And there's an opportunity as the big open porthole becomes visible to see the giant squid. And if you have the patience, I would wait for that. In retrospect, I think it's a real highlight of Disneyland Paris, at least for me.
Yeah, that was such a surprise and delight moment on our trip, because I don't think I was aware that that was a whole attraction there. And I was like, this is so cool. We're walking through the Nautilus. And it's gorgeously pictured right next to Space Mountain at Disneyland Paris. So I have a beautiful picture of the two of them together.
Courtney's brand.
This is my brand. I do have another task, though, possibly for a vacation with Doug, and that is there's the sunken sub from the Walt Disney World attraction at Disney Cruise Line's Castaway Cay. I don't think we're really big on snorkeling, but now I think we have to. I have seen this, but it's been like 10 years. But if you find yourself on a Disney cruise, be sure to check out the snorkeling lagoon on Disney's private island, Castaway Cay. The snorkeling equipment does cost a modest fee to rent, but the crystal clear water is the perfect perfect way to experience this excursion. And among the live fish and various sunken objects, you can find an actual Nautilus ride vehicle from the Walt Disney World attraction. You do have to swim out pretty far in that snorkeling area, from what I remember, but the location is clearly marked by a white buoy, so like you're not just like snorkeling around for 20,000 leagues under the sea trying to find it. You're headed in the right direction. So I think next time we take a Disney cruise, we're going to be snorkeling just to catch a glimpse of that.
You know, for a film that lost its attraction in the 90s, it's still pretty well received and seen in the parks as well, and or just around the world. So it's pretty incredible. As we saw, like Treasure Island didn't really make it into the park. Some of the other live actions didn't really stay as new IPs and new films came out with new characters. But even this one, even though it lost its main headlining attraction, it's still used very frequently by Disney.
Absolutely. One of the things I love about Disney is that they keep certain attractions in certain areas, and maybe they're not always exactly the same as they were. But I do like it that, you know, we can go to Tokyo and experience a whole different kind of Disney adaptation of Verne, and that really excites me. I just love that they do that.
Well, among experiencing those attractions, I think we have quite a few other resources that we like to leave our listeners with. Emily, what would you like to suggest?
So I was going to suggest Jules Verne's The Mysterious Island, which has some more answers. Not like Doug said, maybe to what happened to Captain Nemo, but has a lot more of his backstory, which I think Disney pulled into their film. So if you want to learn more about Captain Nemo and spend more time with him, go check out The Mysterious Island. And then also talking about all the attractions, all of these were mentioned in the Defunctland episodes on YouTube about Disneyland Submarine Voyage and Walt Disney World's 20,000 Leagues Submarine Voyage. It's a two-part, so in about 20 minutes, you can visit all of these attractions.
And he gives credit to the website that I was obsessed with in my formative teenage years, which was 20kride.com. And I will say it looks like it did probably about 15 years ago when I was visiting it. It kind of has that geosites type vibe for it. But this website comes from a place of love, and it has great archive information. He interviewed people that worked the attraction. There's backstage photos of the demolition, as I referenced, and different ride videos from its heyday. So great resource. Not going to surprise anyone here. I love my bonus features if you've listened to any episode. I believe, though, some of the ones, well, you're not going to get the really cool, intricate DVD menu. Some of those are on YouTube. So there's a great making of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, basically documentary feature. It was about 90 minutes long that interviews Richard Fleischer, Kirk Douglas, a lot of people, archival footage of Harper Goff. So like so many people who had a hand in making this film sharing their experience. Also on YouTube, there's a if you search Jules Verne documentary, it'll come up, but it's like only about 15 minutes, and it's Walt Disney and Jules Verne as like imaginative people. So similar as Talking Heads from that documentary was a bonus feature of people connecting Jules Verne and Walt Disney as these imaginative futurists. There's Operation Undersea, which is the episode from Disneyland that's available for purchase on Amazon Prime and Disney Movies Anywhere, but I would love to see it come to Disney Plus, kind of like the Man in Space and different episodes have recently, as well as I'd love to find the Monsters of the Deep, because we found the Peter Lorre clip, but that whole episode is unavailable. But we'll keep digging. We love our resources. Doug, what did you use to prepare?
So my very limited research, and I do want to say it's very limited, so apologies to any huge Verne fan out there that I might have offended by my lack of knowledge. I was able to read Herbert R. Lotman's Jules Verne, an exploratory biography. And what I find really interesting about that biography is that he does what I often do when I write sort of an academic biographical text, is he pulls from historical context. So he's not analyzing as much as he's trying to look at the letters that Verne wrote with his publisher, his mother, his father, his son, and he's trying to pull or extrapolate history from those letters. And so I think it's very revealing, and you get a very intimate picture of Verne and how Verne was living at the time. It's very interesting. One of the things I found most interesting about that, and a lot of people who study Verne know this, is that he was shot in the leg by his nephew. We don't really know why, although some people have tried to say that his nephew was, a little bit at that time experiencing some sort of depression. He actually ended up living the rest of his life in an institution because of the shooting. But yeah, Verne was made lame by his nephew. He fired 2 shots and one ricocheted and hit Verne in the leg, and so he was made lame to that. So just stuff that really interesting stuff. And the other one was Brian Tave's Hollywood Presents Jules Verne, the father of science fiction on screen. And I want to emphasize that subtitle there because, as I said, the people who say that he's not the father of science fiction are in the minority. He often is considered the father of science fiction. And so what this does is it takes a look at all of anything that had any relation to Hollywood at all. So he takes any look at anything that had any relation to Hollywood. So anything that was bought by Hollywood or distributed by Hollywood or presented by Hollywood, including television films. He even looks at Disney parks and video games, and he does a really thorough job of describing them. And I found that very helpful in trying to figure out how Verne's catalog has sort of moved into the mainstream mediums of theater, film, and television and video games.
Wow. So we have lots of resources, listeners, ranging from everything of 1990s or early 2000s online websites all the way to a great biography to dive more into this film, into Jules Verne. Lots of things out there. But if you're ready to move on with us in our summer cinema series, our next episode is not going to be in the water. We are going to be on land. We're going to be reading Pollyanna by Eleanor H. Porter, and we'll be featuring guest reader Jeremy from our friends at the Mad Chatters. So pick that up. That's very easily found on Amazon, Overdrive, Hoopla. It's on probably readily available in your libraries. Easy book to find. And we're going to stay on land for this one. It'll be a little different, Courtney.
Absolutely. If you want to keep up with us in the meantime, you can follow Book of the Mouse Club on Twitter and Instagram at Book of the Mouse. Email us with comments or ideas to bookofthemouseclub@gmail.com. And please be sure to leave us a review on iTunes so others can find our podcast and read and listen along with us. If you want to keep up with me, Courtney, I'm on Instagram at GreatGutsby and on Twitter at Courtney_Guth.
And as always, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Emily_McD. And Doug, where can our listeners connect with your work?
So this sounds a bit weird, but I'm not really on social media. So my writing is published in several different online journals. So Senses of Cinema, I have some stuff in Gale's Literary Criticism series, which are library reference volumes. Continuum, the peer-reviewed journal on African diaspora drama, theater, and performance. Praxis, a writing center journal, and I have chapters in 2 forthcoming books. One is titled New Perspectives in Edward Albee Studies, volume number 4, Edward Albee Influence, and the other is Counter Stories from the Writing Center.
I think Professor Annonax would be very proud of all of your accomplishments there. But much like Captain Nemo, you are off the grid in terms of social media, as you said. But listeners, you're welcome to email us through bookofthemouseclub@gmail.com, and we can get you in touch with Doug if you have any thoughts or follow-up pieces. But in the meantime, Doug, you get to close up this journey together with the quote.
So I don't think it'll be any surprise based on my discussion of my interest in this book, but I'd like to read from a section of the book as the closing quote. I chose this section because I think it relates back to the overall themes we discussed earlier. And in an early chapter of the book, Nemo speaks to the professor for the first time, and Nemo says, "Nothing obliged me to show you hospitality. If I chose to separate myself from you, I should have no interest in seeking you again. I could place you upon the deck of this vessel which has served you as a refuge. I could sink beneath the waters and forget that you have ever existed. Would not that be my right? The professor replies, it might be the right of a savage, but not that of a civilized man. Professor, replies Nemo, I am not what you call a civilized man. I have done with society entirely, for reasons which I alone have the right of appreciating. I do not, therefore, obey its laws, and I desire you never to allude to them before me again. And I chose that quote because I think it really does sum up the themes of the novel and its adaptations, which is that these three men come onto Nemo's land, quote unquote land, his vessel, and they take it as their own. And they don't understand they're colonizing him. And that's exactly what he's against, is colonization. But rather than do away with them, he lets them exist within his realm. And they don't see it. They don't get it. They don't understand. And so when the professor calls him a savage, it's the ultimate sting. It's the ultimate betrayal that, the Nemo is the he is the civilized man. It's everyone else who is savagely and viciously not being human.
I think that's a great quote to close it and a really strong interpretation of it. So thank you so much for bringing all of your knowledge and research to our show today.
I had so much fun. Thank you both.
And it's so great that, Doug, we finally had you on our show after referencing you so many times. I'm glad we're able to share your voice with our listeners.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
The Mouse Club has no affiliation with the Walt Disney Company. The views and opinions expressed by hosts and participants are theirs and theirs alone. They do not represent the organizations or companies they happen to work for.